What would you do if everything around you became a lie? Would you stay quiet to survive, speak out and risk everything? This is not just a question for history books. It's a mirror held up to your face right now. In a world where cowardice is dressed as compliance and silence is rewarded with safety, the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a call to moral awakening. Bonhoeffer wasn't just a pastor or a philosopher. He was a man who stood toe-to-toe with evil and chose truth over comfort, resistance over retreat. And in doing so, he shattered the illusion that ordinary people are powerless against oppressive systems. You're about to learn how fear is manufactured, how silence becomes betrayal, and how true courage begins not with action but with conviction. In the next 4 phases, we'll uncover the slow seduction of tyranny, the inner rot of spiritual cowardice, the price of standing alone, and the resurrection of moral resistance. You will not hear theories. You will hear a roadmap that may save your soul when your world begins to crumble. Because the time is coming when you'll be forced to choose comfort or conscience. And you must be ready. What if the danger wasn't evil, but something far more ordinary? We often think of intelligence as a safeguard, a kind of mental armor against poor decisions. But what if stupidity isn't just the lack of intelligence? What if it's a contagious, corrosive force that can twist the minds of even the most brilliant people? Imagine the terrifying moment when knowledge turns against itself. A scientist with accolades and peer-reviewed papers begins sharing conspiracy theories. A teacher who once shaped minds now parrots divisive rhetoric. A parent, guided by love, makes choices that put their children at risk. These are not villains. These are people like you, ordinary, even admirable, who've surrendered their ability to think critically. This surrender doesn't come with a bang. It comes with quiet consent. The most alarming threat to civilization isn't a group of evil masterminds, it's the slow, silent decay of independent thought. German pastor and philosopher Dietrich Bonhoeffer didn't call it ignorance. He called it stupidity, and he warned that it was not merely a personal flaw but a social disease. How does this disease spread? Through obedience masquerading as morality. In 1961, Stanley Milgram's experiments showed that ordinary people would inflict what they believed were deadly shocks on strangers simply because an authority told them to. No hatred, no ideology, just the abdication of thought. 65% of participants complied, not out of cruelty, but out of blind obedience. Let that sink in. The greatest evil often wears the face of normalcy. These weren't sadists or extremists. They were people like you and my grocery clerks, office workers, young students. Their crime? Letting someone else do their thinking for them. And that's the kind of stupidity Bonhoeffer feared, most the kind that doesn't feel wrong at all. Bonhoeffer's insight wasn't born in a classroom, it was born in crisis. As a pastor in Nazi Germany, he watched an entire nation educated, cultured, devout descend into barbarism. Professors, priests, and politicians all fell in line. Not because they were coerced, but because they stopped questioning. They chose comfort over conscience, simplicity over truth. This form of stupidity doesn't look dangerous, but that's the trap. It doesn't burn books. It just forgets to read them. It doesn't silence speech. It just repeats slogans. Bonhoeffer called it defenselessness, a state where no logic, no fact, no moral appeal can penetrate the mind. When stupidity takes hold, persuasion becomes impossible. We think of evil as aggressive, but stupidity is passive and just as lethal. Bonhoeffer argued that evil often exposes itself, leading to resistance. But stupidity? It hides behind good intentions. It pretends to be moral. That's why it's so hard to confront. You can reason with the wicked. You cannot reason with the mindless. And in today's world, the conditions for stupidity are thriving. We're drowning in noise, manipulated by algorithms, and exhausted by economic insecurity. Who has the energy to research, reflect, and reason when survival is at stake? Our systems reward speed, certainty, and tribal loyalty, not complexity, nuance, or doubt. But here's the truth Bonhoeffer wanted us to face. Stupidity isn't a glitch in the human mind. It's a function of power. The less people think, the easier they are to control. So the real battle isn't between smart and stupid. It's between those who surrender their mind sand, those who dare to keep thinking. You're not being manipulated by accident, you're being molded by design. Every system of power has one hidden objective: to produce obedience disguised as free will. And the easiest way to ensure that obedience? Strip people of their capacity to think. Not through violence, not through fear, but through exhaustion, distraction, and the slow erosion of critical thought. The modern world doesn't silence you, it drowns you. Infinite scrolls, endless updates, and manufactured outrage turn your attention into confetti. While you're busy reacting, you're not reflecting. And that's exactly the point. A thinking population is dangerous to those who feed on compliance. So they flood your mind until it can no longer hold a coherent thought. This is how stupidity becomes systemic, not individual, but industrial. It's not about your IQ. It's about the psychological architecture of your environment. Schools teach memorization, not questioning. Workplaces demand productivity, not philosophy. News cycles offer narratives, not truth. You are conditioned to obey, to perform, to accept. And the scariest part? You feel like you're choosing it. You choose convenience over complexity. You choose belonging over honesty. You repeat what's popular, not because you believe it, but because the cost of dissent is too high. That's not stupidity in the traditional sensate social survival dressed in the costume of opinion. Bonhoeffer warned us, once stupidity takes hold, it becomes contagious. It spreads not through argument, but through imitation. One person defers to the group, then another, until suddenly everyone is saying the same thing loudly, proudly, and without thinking. The individual mind dissolves into collective unawareness. But how does this happen to intelligent, good-hearted people? Because evil doesn't need to destroy their morale, it just needs to make them passive. And stupidity does exactly that. It replaces the need to think with the need to conform. You don't have to become cruel. You just have to stop caring enough to question. And make no mistake, there are always people who benefit from your silence. Politicians who need your vote, corporations who need your money, media who need your clicks. They don't care what you believe, only that you believe what you're told. Your mind is a battlefield, and they're winning without firing a shot. You may not feel stupid, but are you free? That's the real question. Are your thoughts your own, or have they been pre-selected for you? Have your fears been chosen, your enemies assigned, your outrage outsourced? When was the last time you paused and said, what do I really believe and why? Thinking today is an act of rebellion. Not because it's hard, but because it's rare. Because it makes you inconvenient. Because it threatens the systems that thrive on your numbness. But once you begin to think, truly think, the spell starts to break. You remember your agency. You reclaim your vision. Bonhoeffer didn't just diagnose a problem, he dared to resist it. He thought deeply in a world gone mad. He refused to obey what he knew was wrong. And it cost him everything. But his message lives on. Stupidity is not a joke. It is not a quirk. It is the slow death of freedom and the beginning of tyranny. Comfort is the most seductive prison ever built. It doesn't chain your hands, it numbs your will. It whispers promises of safety, predictability, and ease. But underneath it all is a silent demand. Don't question, don't disrupt, don't think too much. And in obeying that demand, we sacrifice something priceless: our integrity. People don't become complicit overnight. They decay by degrees. First, they tolerate lies. Then they repeat them. Finally, they believe them. Not because they're evil, but because the truth became too uncomfortable. And in a world engineered for convenience, we're taught that any discomfort is a problem to be eliminated, not a signal to wake up. Bonhoeffer understood the terrifying truth. Evil often wears a friendly face. It doesn't shout, it smiles. It offers you a job, a sense of belonging, a comfortable routine. It asks only one thing in return: that you stop asking questions. And most good people accept that bargain, because resisting costs too much. The machinery of comfort demands obedience, not awareness. It doesn't want you to confront injustice, it wants you to stream a new show. It doesn't want you to reflect, it wants you to consume. The more entertained you are, the less engaged you are. And the less engaged you are, the easier you are to control. We pretend we're too busy, too tired, too overwhelmed to care. But the real reason is deeper. We're afraid. Afraid that if we truly opened our eyes, we'd have to change. We'd have to confront our own cowardice. And that kind of honesty hurts far more than ignorance ever could. Comfort deadens conscience. Not with malice, but with routine. With small compromises that add up to a life of quiet betrayal. You don't need to be evil to become part of something evil, you just need to be passive. Bonhoeffer called this stupidity, but what he meant was a kind of moral sleepwalking. And here's the horror. The more we sleep, the more the world suffers. Because every injustice that continues needs only one thing: people who look away. People who say, "It's not my problem." People who fear discomfort more than they fear corruption. These people aren't monsters, they're mirrors of what we become when comfort is king. When you prioritize peace over principle, you lose both. History is full of nations that traded truth for silence and justice for stability. And every single time, the outcome was the same. Oppression dressed up as order, genocide disguised as policy, and cowardice passed off as virtue. This is the moment we must choose: comfort or conscience. Because you cannot have both. One feeds the self, the other serves the soul. One makes you blend in, the other demands you stand out. Bonhoeffer chose conscience. He chose to speak when others stayed silent. And he paid with his life, but not with his dignity. If you want to be truly free, you must be willing to be uncomfortable. To question what everyone else accepts. To see what others refuse to look at. To feel the weight of the truth and carry it anyway. That's not just rebellion, that's courage. And in a world drunk on comfort, courage is the rarest form of intelligence. Every tyrant fears one thing: the individual who refuses to stay silent. Not the soldier, not the politician, but the ordinary person who dares to say, "No, I will not go along." This resistance doesn't require weapons, it requires conscience. And in an age of moral decay, that is revolutionary. Bonhoeffer believed that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. That passivity makes you complicit. That to not act is, in fact, an actioner betrayal. And this is where most people fail. Not because they are wicked, but because they are cowards. They tell themselves they're neutral. But in moments of moral crisis, there is no neutrality, only complicity or courage. True resistance begins inside you. It starts as a whisper: "This is wrong." Then it grows into a roar: "This must be stopped." But before you can resist the world's injustice, you must confront your own apathy. That is the first battlefield. And most people lose there, long before they ever step into the public square. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is loyalty to something greater than fear. Loyalty to truth, to conscience, to God, if you believe. And when that loyalty outweighs your comfort, your reputation, even your safety, you become dangerous to systems built on lies. That's why Bonhoeffer was hunted. Not because he was violent, but because he was awake. A single voice of integrity can collapse an empire of deceit. This is why regimes censor, isolate, and mock dissidents. Because moral clarity is contagious. One honest person can make 10 others uncomfortable. One act of defiance can shatter 1,000 rationalizations. In that sense, resistance isn't just action, it's illumination. But moral resistance comes at a cost. You may lose friends, your career, your safety. Bonhoeffer lost his freedom and, eventually, his life. But he gained something far greater, the ability to die without shame. Can we say the same? Or will we look back one day and realize we bartered away our soul for convenience? The truth is this: resistance is never convenient. It never feels safe. That's why so few do it. Because it requires you to step into the unknown, to walk away from what is easy and stand for what is right. But here's the paradox. The moment you act from principle, you become more free than those who mock you. To resist evil is not to become righteous, it is to become real. You won't be perfect, you'll be afraid, but resistance makes you human again. In a world that treats people like parts of a machine, to say no is to reclaim your humanity. And in reclaiming yours, you invite others to reclaim theirs. This is how real change begins, not with revolutions, but with refusals. Refusals to lie, refusals to conform, refusals to betray what you know in your bones to be wrong. Bonhoeffer didn't set out to be a martyr. He set out to be honest. And in a world built on lies, honesty is a kind of rebellion. So ask yourself, what would you die for? That's not a morbid question, it's a moral one. Because what you're willing to die for reveals what you're truly alive for. And if the answer is nothing, then you're already enslaved. But if your answer is truth, justice, or the freedom of the soul, then you are, like Bonhoeffer, a threat to tyranny. So where does that leave us? After all the history, psychology, and harsh truths we've uncovered, we return to the simple and hardest question of all. Who will you choose to be when the world demands your silence? Dietrich Bonhoeffer didn't just warn us about stupidity or cowardice, he warned us about ourselves. He saw how ordinary people, under pressure, surrender their critical thinking, their moral compass, and eventually their humanity. And he paid with his life to show us what refusing to surrender actually looks like. But this isn't just a history lesson. This is your test, because the world today doesn't need more intelligent people. It needs brave ones, brave enough to question their own beliefs, brave enough to risk being disliked, misunderstood, or even hated, brave enough to say no when saying yes would be easier. This is your moment. Maybe you won't face Nazis or dictators. Maybe you won't be thrown into a prison cell. But every day, you are confronted with subtle demands to conform, to stay quiet, to click without thinking, to repost without researching, to believe without questioning. And that is where the battle for your soul begins. Bonhoeffer reminded us that evil often shouts, but stupidity whispers. And when we ignore that whisper, we don't just lose knowledge, we lose our dignity. But there is hope. Because just as stupidity can spread, so can courage. Just as intellectual surrender becomes a habit, so can intellectual resistance. You don't have to change the world in one act, but you can begin by changing your relationship with truth, with discomfort, with your own fear. Remember this: you are not powerless, you are not voiceless. You are not doomed to be a puppet in someone else's game. You can read more carefully, you can listen more critically, you can speak more thoughtfully, you can choose to think even when thinking is painful. That choice alone is enough to begin a revolution within yourself, and perhaps, eventually, within your community. Bonhoeffer stood fast so that we could learn to do the same. And now, his question echoes down through history, reaching directly into your life. Who stands fast? Let the answer be you. Start with one truth. Defend it with your whole mind. Then, do it again tomorrow. That's how resistance is born. That's how freedom survives.